Hello, Internet, and welcome to my show. My name is Brett, and this is YouTube Live DevOps and Docker Talk, or whatever you want to call it. This show's name changes every week, so we don't really have a name. And hopefully you enjoyed those little videos. I just got those. That's actually why I was late in starting this for 5 minutes, because I was finishing up putting a couple of videos together of my dog Whiskey, and he's actually upstairs now. And he is tearing up my house and destroying everything. But he's a great dog, so I thought I'd put some videos in. Who doesn't like puppies, right? I am a dog and cat person, but mostly just dogs. So this show is not about dogs, though, and it is more about your interest in DevOps and specifically containers and all things containers and cloud. So if you are new to this channel, basically we're going to go through some introductions of stuff. I'm going to talk about my stuff, and then we're going to talk about news, some things that happened this week. Sorry, there's a jet overhead. I got a little noise in the background. But then we get to your questions. So get your questions early in the chat. If you came with questions, great. If you think of questions while we're here, that's fine too. This is about an hour to an hour and a half of just us hanging out and talking about DevOps and me trying to help you solve problems. So I don't always have the best answers. I don't always have all the answers, but I try to help out as much as I can. And let's get to it. So this week, besides, there's like a lot of news, actually. There's probably more stuff that I want to talk about this week than in a while. But we're going to hammer through them, and I'll put links in the chat so you can read some of this stuff that I've been reading later, because obviously we want to get to your questions and have as much time for that as possible. So first up, if you're not aware of my courses or even how this thing got started, I have been making Docker courses for years now, and am continually expanding that to new topics and things that beyond just the Docker tooling. And the upcoming course is Docker for Node.js. So if you are interested in Node.js or you are currently a Node.js programmer, this is going to be a perfect course for you to start using containers. Or if you're already using containers today, then this is going to take your container game to the next level if you're Node.js. So that course is coming out in March. So hopefully starting tomorrow, I can say this month. And I don't really try to give deadlines or dates, but I do feel like we're getting pretty close on that one. So I feel confident in saying that March is the month it will be launched. And the way you find out about that course and get the best discounts on that course when it launches is to get on my newsletter. So that's down here, brettfisher.com/Docker. And I will show some of that stuff in a minute. But that's where I put all of my free resources, all of my videos, this YouTube Live, the podcast that I'm now doing, which is coming out of this. So the best questions you ask today may show up in a podcast episode on iTunes and Spotify and all the places you find podcasts. And that's called DevOps and Docker Talk. That's the name of that podcast. So if you just search my name, you'll probably find it pretty quickly. And so we'll talk about that, a little bit of that stuff. I'll give you some links in the chat. But first, just want to see how everybody's doing. It looks like we got some people in chat asking questions already. So you know the game. You know what to do. Bikers up front. Alexandra's next. We got some people that have been around for a while, and I'm sure there's some new people on the call, so that'll be fun to get to your topics here in a little bit. So first up, let's talk about what's going on. I'm gonna have to get one of those hardware things that allows me to hit a button, because takes a little second. All right. And with the magic of green screen, let's talk about my courses. So I have 2 courses. I have a lot of other free resources, including tools for learning Docker and using tools to test clusters, using sample applications for how to deploy containers, and the list goes on and on. Down at the bottom of the list, I've got more stuff there on Windows containers, which is a continuing topic, increasing in popularity, and where to get the best official images for Windows containers if you're a .NET person. And I actually got a question the other day about old ASP, like pre-.NET ASP apps, which do indeed work in containers. You can run those on IIS. You just have to add a couple of things. And so if you're someone who still has old Windows apps and you would love to get into the container world, then we can do that. That works. And then a lot of stuff down at the bottom, it just goes on and on forever. But this is all over at brettfisher.com/Docker. And the newest thing is my podcast, which I mentioned the last couple of weeks. New episodes will be dropping either today or tomorrow, I believe. And that is basically your best questions from here, plus any other topics I want to talk about will show up as short little episodes in that podcast. So that way, if you can't make it here every week, or if you don't have time to watch a bunch of YouTube videos, but you still want to keep learning on these topics, then you can now do it on your commute or while you're washing dishes, which is when I do my podcast, because I work from home, so I don't really have a long commute. So it's whenever I'm doing housework. So the coupons, the best coupons for my courses are here. Obviously, you can see they're all pretty cheap, and more are coming. So we got Node.js coming up next, and then I'll be making some announcements about future stuff, including Kubernetes and stuff like that. So we will that stuff will all be coming later this year. And next up is this Node.js one, which, if you didn't know, Node.js was actually the way I found Docker to begin with almost 5 years ago. In the early part of the project, I was co-founding a startup where we were doing software on the internet like everyone else, and we were using Node.js. We'd actually started using .NET Framework, but then found that Node.js was easier for what we were trying to do back in the day. And so we started using Node.js and NPM, and we realized that Docker was a tool that could really help save us some time. And things have gotten way, way better, right? Like that was back then when it was just the Docker project. Now we have all sorts of tooling and a huge ecosystem of stuff, and that's why we're all here. All right, so let's get to some news, shall we? Let's see. All right. So I'd like to talk a little bit about job stuff every week if I can, because a lot of us, I think, are transitioning into DevOps roles. You maybe have been lucky enough to have been around since DevOps was a thing, or even before it was a thing. But if you're trying to transition into new roles, I mean, who isn't wanting more pay and a higher, salary and all that stuff? So I think it's always interesting to talk about, especially if you're full-time doing this stuff. So let's go through a couple of things that were in the news recently. So we've got this 20 hottest job skills on CNBC, and CNBC isn't always exactly like the outfit that I would go to for that kind of thing, but they're pulling up some pretty interesting statistics on Upwork because, and I used to use Upwork to get business. It's a freelancing website. I'm not sure if it's available in every country, but it's one of the largest, if not the largest, freelancing website. So they see a lot of trends. And if you see a lot of this stuff, it's pretty much all either web tech, cloud tech, or learning specific API frameworks, right? So APIs typically nowadays are usually web based, so it's not exclusively web-based APIs, but it's pretty interesting. Like OAuth, authentication doesn't sound very enticing, but the fact that it's in the fastest growing job skills is pretty interesting. But Kubernetes is on that list. Vue.js, a front-end framework, is on that list. And what's interesting is that a lot of this stuff intersects somehow with Docker and containers in general, because you're either going to be running that stuff in Docker. Oh, I just realized I don't have the screen on. Boom.
I've been texting you and trying to call you.
So, thank you. Sorry about that. So if you see something in chat and it doesn't look right on my screen, or if I don't sound right, jump in the chat and let me know. So, by the way, if you're in chat and you say something in chat, I can make you a moderator so you can control if you have chance.
I can do that. I tried texting you, but okay.
Right. Well, I'm not saying text me about that, but you can control and moderate things in chat, like delete spam comments and stuff like that. All right. So anyway, I will send this link into chat, and let's put that in there. Yeah. Thanks for the reminder. Yeah, I forgot to click the button. All right. So The next thing up is job interview questions for Kubernetes. So since Kubernetes was one of the top 20 job topics in the CNBC report, I thought I would put in this interesting thing about job interview questions, how to prepare. So I wouldn't use this, and I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of cramming on a topic that you really don't know just so that you can sound like you know it in a job, right? I'm always very concerned about genuine interviews, genuine resumes. It's one of the things in this industry that you can put a lot of buzzwords on your resume, but you may never have ever actually worked with them. So I would say that if you haven't learned Kubernetes or you're not familiar with Kubernetes, don't go into an interview pretending, right? Be honest and open. And I think that honesty is being genuine and talking more about how you learn and what you're passionate about. I think that's more important to a lot of job hires, managers, than it is that you happen to know everything about all the latest tools, right? Because if you are a good learner, and you have to be in this industry, then you're going to be able to learn the next tool, and it's not going to be a big deal that you don't know it. What is a big deal is what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? How do you learn? And what are you learning from now, right? Because we're always all learning something. Whether that's on-the-job training with some new tool at the job or something after work that you're listening to on a YouTube video or podcast. So I think that that's more important. So I wouldn't say use these as techniques to fake it. But obviously, if you are honest and say, I haven't used Kubernetes yet, but I'm learning lots about it. I'm learning lots about Docker and Swarm and all these other things. That's going to at least go farther than someone that says, I don't use it yet, and just leaves it at that, right? I mean, obviously, passion, I think, really makes a difference when you're trying to differentiate yourself from someone else in your competition on a job. So check that stuff out. All right. Anyway, moving on from jobs. The next thing on here is that there have been some changes at Docker, but this is not new. Like all of the tech industry has been in a consolidation around containers. So over just the last couple of months, we've seen companies getting bought up in the container space, mergers, stuff like that. So what's happening over at Docker, you might have seen this article, was that they had a cutting in force. They cut about 10% of the workforce. And the Register here is reporting, and actually it's an interview with the CEO of Docker talking about how they're doing some realignment and changing some stuff. And I don't really have a whole lot of insider information on this, but I think it just goes to show that, even though the Docker ecosystem is very successful, all the players in that market are constantly trying to figure out how to make money. And with Docker, it's Docker Enterprise. They talk about it in this article. I'll actually throw this link in the chat because they talk about Docker Enterprise being their focus and they're the main driver of revenue for the company. So I'm sure they've got other partnerships and things that they don't necessarily disclose. They're not a public company, so we don't know revenue, but they are open and did talk about that they were looking to be cash flow positive in the next year. And so being about 5 years old as a company and having multiple rounds of investment, I would say that this is about the time that they need to start doing that. So that's been their focus for the last couple of years. And I just think it's interesting to sort of see the inside of what all this stuff is doing. The same thing has been happening in other companies, right? VMware, I think it was that recently bought Heptio, which was one of the the founders of Heptio were one of the co-founders of Kubernetes. So we're seeing consolidation in that part of the space, and there's a lot of movement, right? We've seen stuff like GitHub got bought last year, and now we've heard about Travis CI. If you're not familiar, the Travis CI platform might be dissolving. We're not really sure, but they had some big layoffs recently. Nobody really knows what's going on, but they just, Travis CI is a CI platform. And so there's been some traffic and stuff talking about what the other platforms are doing. There's GitLab, which is a popular DevOps CI/CD tool. And GitLab has been really, I think, kind of killing it, putting out really good products and have a unique take on things. And they put out a blog article that said they're here to stay, they're not getting bought out, and stuff like that. So things are always moving, the market is always changing, and I thought that would be interesting to read up on that article. All right, next up. On Red Hat, which I don't talk a lot about the enterprise releases of Linux because, quite honestly, I don't have any clients using them. I don't, not that I haven't in the past, but currently I'm not interacting with them, so I'm not always staying up to date on the latest, SUSE Linux and Red Hat Linux and all the enterprise stuff. So I thought this was interesting, though, because the next version of Red Hat doesn't have Docker. So Red Hat is going with their own tools and building their own pipeline of tools around OpenShift, and they have basically decided they are no longer going to allow you, essentially, on their supported stack to install Docker specifically. Docker inks Docker. Now, what they do is they emulate Docker with some other tools that they help maintain in the open source community. One of them is Podman. And it's an interesting article just about the changing industry and how Red Hat is trying to distinguish themselves in a market where, you know, there's lots of players that are competitive. So in order to be, I guess, competitive in this landscape, what they're doing is they are creating their own stack, right? They have the OpenStack, which is their variant of Kubernetes. So it's their take on orchestration with some unique stuff built in. They also made an announcement last year that they would no longer support Swarm, which makes sense because they don't, you know, open source is a thing, but Red Hat typically picks the open source that it's going to officially support in their stacks. And they've chosen Kubernetes as the orchestrator, the only one that you can use, I guess, really, unless you just want to run regular containers without an orchestrator. And so I don't really know how this impacts. Biker's asking if this is true of CentOS. I really don't know anything other than what this article provides. I don't know if the next version of CentOS will be the same way. I have to assume it will because it tends to follow what RHEL is doing. But it's interesting because if you're a Docker tooling fan, Red Hat is sort of forcing you to make a choice. Either you can go with a different distribution and do it the Docker way, or if you like the Docker tooling, or you can go the Red Hat way and use their tools. And I know that at the end of the day, these are all just images, and we're able to hopefully all share the same images, and that's a standard, an OCI standard. But, you know, doesn't really matter, I think, at the end of the day, whether you emulate the Docker CLI or not. It's still a different tool. And if you're still running in production, you're going to have to get used to different tools. So I haven't used any of these tools, so I don't have an opinion on them. I haven't yet checked out Podman, although I have certainly looked into the README back when it started gaining popularity. And I thought it was kind of interesting that they're emulating a different tool with their own. And I don't remember the last time that anyone did that. So anyway, if anyone wants to check that out, I haven't checked out the beta yet. So if anyone has any experience with that, feel free to throw it in chat and talk about what you love and don't love about that. I'm sure there's pros and cons on either side, right? Red Hat's full of really smart people, so I'm sure that they have good reasons behind this, and that the tools are, you know, good for what you're doing. So if I always tell everybody, if you're going to go Red Hat, go all in on Red Hat, just because it's kind of like with Windows Server, right? If you're going to go Windows Server, you go all in on Windows Server. There's so many tools that are built out of the box with Windows Server and Red Hat that it doesn't make a lot of sense to go buy a bunch of third-party products when you can really just get the tooling out of the box with that and use it out of the box. So I think this is it's obviously a working strategy for them, and I've always been a big fan of the Windows world for many decades. So I feel like Red Hat is sort of the Linux equivalent of them, of just bundling a lot of stuff out of the box. And now you can get these 4 tools: the Podman, the Builda, which I love that name, Builda. It's like the Boston accent coming in there, and Scopio and the module, which I'm not familiar with the first and last tools on that list. So we'll have to definitely check those out. So anyway, they talk about how, you know, Kata containers, Docker EE, Docker CE are other standards or other implementations of the standard, and that they're going with their own. So that's an interesting thing coming forward. All right, so last little piece of news, actually 3 little things I just want you to read. These aren't really news topics, but Tonis from Docker always has great blog posts, and he put out something about experimenting with Rootless Docker. And so if you didn't know, Docker itself runs as root on all systems, mostly because it needs to do certain things to control the networking and the storage and a lot of the stuff that it does with permissions. It needs root to do that. Now, if you have a certain set of needs that maybe you can get away without root, Tonis has talked about some recent commits from one of the community members, one of the open source community members, that has allowed it to be usable underneath your user account. So you wouldn't technically need root or a root daemon to run it. So check this out and tell me if you're interested in that and play with that. I have not played with it myself, but he gives a really great demo just right in the screen here as a as a gift. So that's interesting. Now, as a part of this, I learned, because he has this link here, cross-posted on the Docker engineering blog, which takes you to this new blog that Docker's building out, which I'm a huge fan of. Netflix does this. Other companies do this, where the engineers themselves get to sort of talk geeky and not have to worry about sort of mass market appeal blog posts. They can just talk engineering talk on their own blog and not have to worry so much about, making it make sense to a non-technical audience, right? So you've got the regular blog for Docker, blog.docker.com, and then now we have this new blog just focused on engineering. So I'm going to throw that in the chat. So definitely, if you're still a person like me that uses RSS readers to read blog articles, and if you still read blogs instead of just Twitter and Instagram all day, then definitely check this out. It's pretty neat. They've only got 3 or 4 or 5 articles in there at this point, but supposedly they're going to be adding content regularly, possibly every week. So we'll see. That's going to be an interesting one to keep watching. I always love the geeky long form blog posts. So yeah, check that out. And I think the last thing on my list is that upcoming, in case you're lucky enough to be in a city where there's a Docker meetup, then the 6th birthday party, which means basically every year when Docker has the anniversary of when the project first was announced as an open source project, that's coming up in March. And it was basically, if you don't know, 6 years ago, the founder of Docker was standing at PyCon, a Python conference, and just did a 7-minute little demo, because they had like lightning talks and they could only do 7-minute talks. And he did a quick little demo, and he called the project Docker, and it was from a company called .cloud, and they were a competitor to Heroku. And it was Solomon Hykes that did that demo. You can still find it on YouTube if you just sort of search Docker Solomon PyCon, I think is what you probably could search. And it's a quick little 7-minute demo. And it's a little bit different than what it does today. It's all the very, very basic features. It doesn't have a lot of the fanciness that we have today. But it's really funny because at the end of it, they cut him off and they are like, okay, you're done now. You can walk away. And no one, like the guy that introduced him and then cut him off at the 7-minute mark, probably had no idea that it was going to turn into a $1 billion evaluation startup company, right? Sort of a fun little blast from the past. So if you're in a city that has a Docker meetup, check out this blog post at Docker. They have a map, and this map will definitely be getting filled out more in the few weeks coming up as everybody starts to announce their meetups. So I know we have hundreds of meetups. I run a meetup here locally, and I have for several years now. So check out that blog article and see if there's a meetup near you, because they may be having a Docker birthday party. And if you're ever going to go to a physical meetup or drive to one that's maybe not near you, then this is the one to happen, because we'll have birthday cake. There'll be party giveaways. There'll be lots of demos and sample workshops that you can run through for hours on end. And usually Docker provides free infrastructure on the internet so that you can run all this stuff in your browser. That way you can build out Kubernetes and Swarm and all these things in a browser without having to have a bunch of horsepower in your laptop. So that's a really neat thing that happens in the spring. We also do something in autumn on the second half of the year, but it's not near as big a deal as this. So I myself am getting ramped up to announce our local Docker party that will be sometime in the next couple of months. But they try to center it around the week of, what is it this year? The week of 18th to 31st in March. But not every Docker meetup is going to be that week. So hopefully check that out and see if you have a meetup near you that you can go check out, because they're always fun to meet other DevOps and Docker container fans and that kind of stuff. So, all right, let's get to the chat. We've got a bunch of questions in here, and I want to get to your questions. So the way this works is I work from the top down, and if I have answers for your questions, great. I might put some links in there for answers. And if you have a great question that's a very common question and I have a decent enough answer, it may end up in a little clip video here on this channel, and it may end up in my podcast. So you can get all that stuff, like I mentioned earlier, over on the brettfisher.com/Docker page. You can get all the links to the YouTube videos in this channel as well as the podcast there. So let me scroll up to the top. I believe Biker was first with the first question. I'm feeling totally smug today. I figured out a UCP layer 7 interlock failure. I exec'd into the interlock proxy container and found the Nginx conf was not being updated with a new deploy. Yeah, so if people didn't know, Docker Enterprises uses a front-end proxy system called interlock. You can actually find it on GitHub. And it uses Nginx, so it reconfigures Nginx to provide HTTP proxy to all your different containers inside of your cluster. So let's see. I don't know if this is turning into a question. I'm not sure. I think maybe this is just a statement. So for anyone using Enterprise, if layer 7 routing stops working, try resetting the interlock service. Oh, and you give a nice command there on Docker service update, and you have a success article. And yeah, that's good stuff. How do I ensure? The article is, how do I ensure the UCP routing mesh UCP interlock proxy continues running in the event of a failed update? It's also cool that Docker lets you unravel things by jumping inside and creating test containers, spinning up parallel examples. Much nicer than the mainframe days. So that's not technically a question, but Biker, that's a great story to tell. I think failure stories are a fun way for us to learn about how other people break and fix things. And I'm, for some reason, feeling very Windowsy today, but if you're a Windows person, one of my favorite talks, and it's a series of talks, is the case of the unexplained. Windows. And this is from Mark Rasanovich. So he is a technical fellow at Microsoft. He actually created the sysinternals and wininternals tool. If you've ever run a Windows machine and you've ever had to manage any sort of Windows machine, whether it's desktop or server for an organization, you've probably used one of his sysinternal tools. And so if you ever just search Case of the Unexplained, basically, and I don't know if he does it anymore. I saw in there it listed 2018. So I don't know if he does the talk. Yeah. Windows troubleshooting with Mark Rasanovich. So what he does is he takes stories just like that, Biker. He takes stories of people that send in things that failed on Windows servers usually, or even just Windows desktop. And it might be a driver bug, or it might, basically what he does is he takes the story and he finds the root cause. So he replays the problem, and basically instead of us all just saying, well, I rebooted and it fixed it, right? That's not, you didn't really know what was the true root problem. He will debug the system at an extremely low level sometimes just to get to the root code lines or functions, even in closed sourced software, using his own tools, essentially, that he's built out over the decades. And it's always fascinating. I don't know that there's an equivalent of that in the Linux world. It would be pretty cool if he started doing more Linux stuff, because since Microsoft's getting so Linuxy nowadays. I did hear, by the way, they are converting or rebuilding some of their sysinternal tools, which are fantastic if you're not aware of those for Windows. I use them all the time, even though I'm not primarily a Windows person anymore. But they're rebuilding some of those tools for Linux. So if you are interested at all, I don't know if they've launched them yet, but they make some really great GUIs for managing and troubleshooting and digging into, not to Docker, but into specifically Windows stuff. And they're going to evidently make some of those available on Linux now. So that'll be great, because some of them are really great to work with. So let's move on. Next question. Alexandra says, hey, Brett, did you manage to migrate your JavaScript to TypeScript? Oh, a lot of Docker and TypeScript mistakes on your last Twitch stream. I just used TS-Lint Visual Studio plugin for TypeScript project. Okay. I'm not sure if I got your whole text. Okay, so what he's talking about is that I also do Twitch streaming. So when I'm not, this is sort of the official nice stuff on, I got green screen backgrounds and I've got quality content that we're talking about, and I have a plan. Essentially, YouTube is where I have plans and I do things that I have a plan on, and then Twitch is just random streaming of anything that I'm working on. I don't do it very often. I would like to do it more, but last week, I think it was last week. No, it was Tuesday. This is a long week. Tuesday of this week over on Twitch, I worked with a friend of mine, Kevin, and we were working with TypeScript and node.js and getting that working in Docker, and then also talking about .NET Core and Dockerizing that application. And I didn't get everything fully fleshed out in the talk or in the Twitch. We did like a 3-hour Twitch stream. So I will send, in case you're a Twitch fan and you want to check out Twitch or rewatch that video, it's on my Twitch channel over here, and you can go check that out later. And of course, if you subscribe there, just like here, if you subscribe there and click, I think it's a little heart, it'll notify you when I go live on Twitch. It's not near as short and entertaining. It's a lot of boring troubleshooting and stuff like that usually, but we have some fun. I play some music in the background, and it's a good time. So I didn't finish everything on there, but yeah, I did figure it all out, and that will be stuff upcoming in my Node.js course, and I'll talk a little bit about TypeScript and how to set that up for development in Docker. But thanks for asking. I'm glad you saw that. And I have not used TS-lint yet, so I will be checking that one out. That's, I'm sure, the same as JS-lint for TypeScript. So that may or may not be built into Visual Studio Code. I'm not really sure. It seems like part of it is. All right, up next, hello from Greece, and congratulations for a great show. Other types of clusters use Stoneth fence mechanisms to prevent a split brain situation. Is this applicable to the Docker Swarm cluster? Can you explain what happens to the containers running on a node after this node is network isolated from the rest of the Swarm cluster, but it is still functional? What happens if there is a container that is accessing a shared storage volume? And I think that's the end of your question. Those are all really great questions. I'm gonna mispronounce your name, Gerasimos. Sorry about that. I probably misspelled it or mispronounced it. The answers there are, I don't know what Stoneth or Fence are, unfortunately, but Swarm is the same as Kubernetes, is the same as Mesos, is the same as every other container orchestrator that I know of. They all use the Raft Consensus algorithm. So a couple of resources. Some of these are mentioned as resources in my Docker Mastery course, and then more of them in my Swarm Mastery course. But they all essentially work the same way, and they use, for example, etcd. If you've heard of etcd, that's the back-end, essentially, key value store for Kubernetes. And so Kubernetes relies on that for its database, and that etcd system uses Raft as its consensus algorithm. So if you just look up Raft Consensus, you'll end up coming with, like, there's a Wikipedia page on it. There's an entire GitHub website that you can find and read about it. There's a really great site called Raft, The Secret Lives of Data, which is a nice visualization of walking you through how the communications of a Raft cluster work against each other and how they deal with failover, how they determine who's the leader, because you have this manager and worker sort of relationship in Swarm, and you have that similar concept in Kubernetes. So you definitely have to worry about consensus. Now, the short answer to all of that is that with Raft, the rule is it has to be odd numbers of managers, or servers running a copy of the management database, and you need a majority online and connected to each other. I can speak for Swarm, if you have one server, and let's say it's the fourth manager or the third manager, right? You have three managers, and there's a split brain situation, then you can only lose one of them, right? So if you split the one from the two, then the two over here will be fine, and you can still manage the cluster there because they have majority, right? 2 is a majority of 3. So they have majority, and they will keep operating and making decisions for the cluster. The single one over here will no longer have authority. It won't be able to manage or execute new containers. Now, I will say that any running containers work fine, right? Like if you've got containers launched on all 3 of these nodes, they still run. Just because you've lost consensus doesn't mean that containers stop. What it means is the management engine can't make any future decisions on the nodes that are not full of consensus. So if there's any worker nodes or anything, like say there's a split in the middle, the guys on this side, they won't be able to start new containers, or if there's a failed health check, they won't be able to kill and recreate the container to make it healthy again. They won't be able to do stuff like that. Obviously, if you have a full network segmentation there, and it's not just some sort of protocol latency on the swarm itself, if it's a full network segmentation, then you've got other problems like, any containers running over here can't talk to those, and that's, more about your application and whether it can survive that than it is Swarm itself. The last question I think you have was on shared storage and volumes. That is more about Linux and how it manages connections to servers. So, because really what's happening in the background is if you have let's say a RexRay plugin in your Docker Swarm that simply makes NFS connections to remote hosts, like in AWS's EFS solution, then that's just going to matter as whether or not that server can contact the EFS solution, right? That's not so much a Swarm specific thing. That's just, can the Linux box talk to its data? If the application can't get to its data, then the application is probably going to crash or do something really bad. So that's not so much about Swarm and whether Swarm is going to do anything about that, right? Swarm's not acting as some sort of buffer for the protocol. It's simply providing the container a path to storage on the Linux host, and it automates that for you. So the answer there is it depends on the storage and the solution that you have for that one, right? If you're curious more about that, there is a great talk, and last time I did this, Laura Frank was actually on the chat, which was hilarious. But if you look up on YouTube, Laura Frank, let's see if I can find it. Oh, there's one from Container Camp, sorry. And then there's another one here. So I will send you the one to DockerCon because I have watched that one. I was there when she did it. It was really great. And I will put that in here. So to fully answer your question, check out that talk. It talks about Raft Consensus and how Raft works. And then it shows a demo in Swarm of, she basically gives out a demo of how to, what happens when it fails and how Raft deals with failure and stuff like that. And maybe how in Swarm you can look at the Swarm Raft database and see what it's doing. So it's really interesting stuff in there that I think if you're definitely considering running Swarm in production, you should definitely watch that video multiple times, play with the Raft, and maybe break it on purpose. Do network segmentation by just turning off NICs or something and see how things behave, right? How does your app behave? I always want to do that sort of thing with any of the apps I'm doing in some sort of test environment and just play around with the orchestrator, breaking it in various ways, shut down a Docker engine on a server, turn on a firewall that prevents communication, stuff like that. Because you want to see how your apps are going to behave. And every app behaves differently, right? It's not always about the orchestrator. Sometimes it's just, does your app handle failures well? Does it crash and then the orchestrator restart it? Or does it just freeze and then do nothing? And then your orchestration isn't using proper health checks, so it can't know that your app is down, so then it doesn't restart it. There's all sorts of stuff that you'll discover as a part of that process. And it's something that I talk a little bit about in my Swarm Mastery course, because that's also a part of doing rolling updates, right? Once you do container orchestration, you usually want to start updating things more often, and that's going to require that you do updates during the daytime, during a non-outage window, right? You're going to have clients connected to your apps, and you're going to need to change them. So that's when you have to care about connections and rolling over connections and timeouts of connections and all that sort of stuff that gets way more complicated. And orchestration is part of it, but also your apps have to concern themselves with how connections are handled. How does it shut down connections and move them to a new container, that kind of thing. So hopefully all that stuff happens and it works well for you. So definitely check out, I really recommend any of Laura's videos. She always does great talks at conferences. So you can find a lot of her stuff on YouTube. All right, great question. I think I skipped a question up here. Biker says, I'm going to DockerCon. Can you list your top 5 workshops/sessions, of course, including your own? So if you didn't hear last week, I will be at DockerCon, and I will be giving a talk on Docker for Node.js, and then I will be doing a workshop on Swarm. So this year there are paid workshops in San Francisco, and quite honestly, I haven't looked through all of the talks because they, as far as I know, they have not all been announced. So, but let's go look. I personally think that just about everything there is great because it's super focused on the Docker tooling and the container ecosystem of tools, right? DockerCon historically has been the conference where all the big news in the container world has been announced. Kubernetes was announced at DockerCon back when it was created. And nowadays we have all these other container conferences, right? You've got KubeConf and Cloud Native Conf, and you have Linux Summit, and you have all these other places where there are container tracks, and containers are everywhere. So it's hard now to go to just one conference for the container community, but I still think DockerCon is the best. So I like going. So if we go to the agenda and I go down to workshops, I would say that there's a couple of sessions I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is Don's session on, I think it's called moving from Swarm to Kubernetes and back again. And it's a conversation about, he works at a large insurance firm, and that they deployed Swarm initially, and then they grew into Kubernetes, and then they moved some of their workloads from Swarm to Kubernetes. And I guess what this talk this year is going to be about is why they moved some of their workloads away from Kubernetes back to Swarm. And I think anytime people are moving from Swarm to Kubernetes or from one orchestrator to another, moving from ECS to something else or from something to ECS, whatever, I think those are always really compelling stories as long as the team knows their orchestration well and they're not just doing it because everyone said do it, right? I like to hear good reasons, business-based reasons, technology and logic-based reasons, not just we jumped on board this one because we thought it was cool. Because we don't learn anything from that, right? I mean, we all do that. We all have times where we just pick a tool because it's cool. But we need more stories of people having success and why they had success, and then people having failures and why they had the failures, so that we can all reason about these decisions and understand when we need these tools, right? Now, this is something that's happened on every part of the ecosystem. Years ago, we were all discussing Puppet versus Chef. And there's the AWS versus Azure. There's always competing tools in every part of a healthy ecosystem. So I think for container tooling, it's moving so quickly, and we're still trying to all understand the tools, that it's good to have those kind of things. So anytime I hear someone telling a sort of war stories from the trenches kind of thing, I like to go check that out. If you look at the workshops this year, they're paid workshops, and I would say go. To me, the most value I get out of a conference is not from the sessions, it's from the people I meet there and the relationships that I have. So I would say DockerCon is a great way to make those relationships because it's one of the most community-friendly conferences around. If you're new to DockerCon, they actually have a program where they pair you up with a veteran, and you get to hang out at, every day. I think there's like a meetup point where you go and you talk about your day, and you basically make friends that have got experience with the conference and the community. And it's cool because if you're new and you're there by yourself, maybe your job only could send one person. It's kind of sucks when you're at a party or you're at some of the events and you don't have anyone to talk to because you don't know anyone yet. So that's a really great way. They call it Docker Pals. That's a pretty fun name. But I would say that when it comes to the content, I always split my time between the things I need to know right now to do my job, right? Those are the most important sessions because they're going to solve problems when I get back to the office. And then I always make sure that I take a little time and I go to ones that I have no intention of using in my day job anytime soon, but there's something fun that I'm really interested in, right? Because we got to have a little bit of fun. So I always throw those in. And for me, it might be, I might go check out the Jaeger and Prometheus from Kevin Crowley, a Docker captain, a really great guy. I might check out that workshop. And then maybe for work, though, maybe I'm working at a company that's doing .NET and I have to go to the modernized .NET apps because that's part of my job and I need to really learn that stuff quickly. But maybe I want to check out Jaeger, and I'm going to go to that workshop too. So I don't know. That's how I split it up. I don't really have any preference on that, and I haven't haven't actually even looked at the agenda, so that's a great question. But you can all go to DockerCon website, and by the way, I will put this in chat. I have a coupon code. If you haven't signed up for DockerCon yet and you want to go, go check it out. You get 10% off with coupon code Captain Brett. I'll put this in chat, Captain Brett. So I don't get anything from that. They just, because we're Docker captains, we get a coupon code to share out with our communities. And you're a part of my community, so let's meet at DockerCon and hopefully save you some money. So check that out. Great question. Let's see. Darren says, funny you mentioned jobs. I'm waiting to hear back on a DevOps job. They even have me do a Docker test with Swarm and Docker coins. That is fantastic. My friend Jerome, who's the one who came up with Docker coins, he would love to hear that. So I'm going to have to take a screenshot of that and tell him later that that was actually a job entrance exam to set up Docker coins. Docker coins is an open source set of tools and examples. If you go to container training, I help out. There's a group of us now, 3 of us mostly. Bridget, Jerome, and I, all members of the container community, and we lead groups of people and try to help people learn. And all of this stuff's open source. And down at the very bottom, you can see all of our slides on Kubernetes, Swarm, and Docker. And it's basically at this point almost 2,000 slides of content, along with recorded videos of some of these workshops. Sometimes we do them in 2 hours, and sometimes we do them in over 2 days, and it just depends on the time we have. So definitely go check that stuff out if you want some free training. And Docker Coins is one of the sample applications you will deploy, whether you're doing Swarm or Kubernetes. You'll learn how to deploy a multi-tier distributed application that mines Docker coins. It's pretty fun. So that's cool, Darren. Good story. Redo says Docker 1809.3 is out. Okay, excellent. I saw that was in a release client. So thanks for that. If you didn't know about Docker releases, you can go over to github.com/docker/CE. I think it's Docker CE. And go to /releases, and then you can see the public, well, they're all public, but the public releases of the open source Docker engine. And that was just released an hour ago, so you win the award for today for the most current news, because that was an hour ago, which means that happened right before we went live. So good call. There's not a whole lot to change because we just had 1809.2 released, but there are some runtime bug fixes and stuff there. I don't believe there's any new features because it is a patch release, so expect it to really just be fixing of problems. So you might want to check that out and update your Docker engines, and thanks a lot. Thanks for that tip. Biker was asking about whether it's true for CentOS, if they're going to be the same as Red Hat, and I would assume yes, that the next version of CentOS will follow the Red Hat versions and have the Podman and the other tools build instead of the default of using the Docker toolkit. All right, next question. Fagner says, Brett, for those who develop with Spring Cloud, which concerns we need to care when running multiple instances registered at Eureka? When I use Compose, everything works fine, but with Stack, no luck. And thanks for your course at Udemy. It helps me a lot, but I'm still learning. Expect more questions very soon. Well, thanks. Thanks so much for being a student and buying one of my courses on Udemy. I really appreciate it. And I would say that Spring Cloud, there's nothing special about Spring Cloud that I've never used it, so I don't really have any experience with it directly. But if you're building out a stack file, the only thing that I could think of would be that would conflict is if you have in your stack file hard-coded published ports, so different stacks won't be able to use the same published ports. So you'll either need to put a front-end proxy in front of that and use that as another layer if you're talking about web traffic, or you're going to need to publish your different stacks on different ports. That's probably the only thing other than maybe using the same volumes, but that's not usually an issue. People don't normally end up with the same volumes. Ports are always a limiting factor. If you go though to dog versus cat, dog versus .cat, then that's my swarm samples for real world examples. And I'll put that in chat for you. So you can check that out, because that goes through a bunch of different YAML files that are examples on how to deploy various things in Swarm, and you might learn something from that you wouldn't have been in one of my lectures specifically about that kind of thing, right? Like if you scroll down, one of the more complicated ones is, well, Portainer is very complicated because it's a monitoring solution, so it's got lots of containers. So you could definitely look at that. But one of the ones that I would recommend is the proxy global. So stack proxy global file is a sort of front-end proxy that will act as a reverse proxy for all your web traffic and all the other containers in various stacks. So imagine you have multiple stacks, and then those are all your web apps, and then you put this proxy stack in front of those, and the traffic that's coming into your Swarm goes through traffic and then is distributed to the right containers that it needs to go to. And that's what this stack does. And this one's a little more complicated because it does things like it hard codes or bind mounts essentially to the host ports. And so it avoids the overlay networks for incoming traffic and mounts directly to the host port on each node. And that's an interesting thing that I don't necessarily talk about in the Swarm Mastery course yet. Although I do definitely want to add those videos. So go check that stuff out. See if that helps you with your stack files. And yeah, feel free to ask more of those questions in the Swarm, the Docker Mastery Slack chat. So that comes with the course, right? All right, Jorn, what's your take on backup and restore of Docker Swarm? Any recommendations and or caveats? No, so there's a database in Swarm and it's stored in a file and you can back up that file. There are multiple ways you can go about that. If you're in one of my courses, I think you can search, if you're in Docker Mastery, for example, you can search the Q&A and the backup topic comes up in there a couple of times. There is a tool, I think, there is an article, I believe, from Docker. Yeah, it's on their Success site. And Success is sort of like their KB article portal, sort of for their paid customers. But Swarm, the paid version of Swarm is the same as the free version of Swarm. So regardless of whether you're using CE or EE, the Community Edition or the Enterprise Edition, you can use this article and these tips for backing up Swarm. And that is basically it. That's the recommendation from the mothership on what you need to do to back up and manage Swarm. The other thing a lot of people ask questions about is how do I update Swarm? That also might be in there in a different article, but basically you essentially take your first Swarm node, you drain it, right? You drain the node of all its containers, then you can do an upgrade of it. You can just simply do an apt-get upgrade or however you update the OS to get the new version, and then you mark it as available, and instead of being drained, you just undrain it, I guess, by marking it as available, and then and then you go to the next node and you go on and on. You can also do a way where you add a new node so that you have one extra manager, so that in case you're normally running 3 managers, you can add a 4th, and that way you know that that's healthy and that new 4th node is the new version. And then you take down your first node, and then you add a brand new second node. And the reason you might do that is a lot of people nowadays are preferring, even on their hosts, to not do in-place upgrades. They just simply replace them, right? The idea here is we have disposable infrastructure. If you're using infrastructure as code and using tools like Ansible or CloudFormation or, any other, name your tool, Terraform. If you're using any of those tools or even just shell scripts to automate building out your servers, then you should be able to easily stop a node, replace it with a brand new machine, and then you're not taking the risk of something funky happening during the upgrade, right? So you're getting fresh new machines. That also, by the way, the advantage of that method is that it ensures that your documentation on how to recover from failure works, right? Because essentially replacing a server every time you upgrade means you're testing out your documentation on how to recover from failure. So that's a really great way to ensure that you know how to do this. And I advise even just trying that on occasion, just taking down a node, seeing what happens in a test infrastructure, possibly even in production during a low a low time of low traffic, so that you can get very comfortable with the idea of recovering from failure and knowing what your apps will do during failure, right? I think that a lot of times we're too afraid to touch things, and we shouldn't. We should really be advocating for almost failure-driven infrastructure, right? Where you're deliberately trying to do things with failure. Netflix has this thing called Chaos Monkey. I'm not suggesting you go all out with that. That's a whole nother level of chaos. But that's certainly a way that I like to do things where when I update servers on DigitalOcean on my own website, for example, I prefer to just take one down, add another one, and roll through them that way. And that way I get the latest edition of their server infrastructure. I make sure that I've got the latest tools that they deploy on the servers and all that stuff, and I don't have to worry about old infrastructure causing problems. So, great question. Let's see. What's next? Thanks, everyone, for the thanks, Alexandra, for the recommendation on a backup script. But yeah, that article is going to completely answer all your questions, I think, there. Can you recommend, Michael says, can you recommend, or better yet, put out a course on high-level securing a Docker Swarm deploy as for a financial institution? Well, so Swarm comes pretty darn secure out of the box. Everything is encrypted. Everything is mutually authenticated using TLS. So I don't have any specific recommendations other than if you're in a financial institution and you're using Swarm, you probably should be using Docker Enterprise, because that platform has many more layers of security and checks and balances than the free open source tools. In fact, one of the ways that Docker specializes with their paid products is in the area of security and security automation, scanning of your images to make sure that you're not accidentally deploying containers into production that have vulnerabilities, or at least, because there's always vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that you care about, making sure that you can't run containers on a Docker server unless they've been approved through a signing process using a tool called Notary, and you can notarize your images to make sure they go into production. It's got a lot more tooling in there around that. In terms of just basic Swarm security, the nice thing is with Swarm is you can't deploy it in an unsecured way. You can't accidentally deploy Swarm and it somehow can be used by anyone on the internet, right? That's not true of every tool in the container ecosystem. So Swarm comes out of the box default to secure. It encrypts the database by default. I'd say that if you were going to take the next step beyond the basics, then the next step you need to do is remove the key for the encrypted database, the Raft database in Swarm. And so if you just go to the command line and you do Docker Swarm help, you'll see there that there's a little thing in there about unlock and lock, or unlock key and stuff like that. And that essentially will allow you to lock the database where the key will not be stored on the hard drive. It'll only be in memory, which means if you restart Docker, Docker won't be able to decrypt the Swarm database where all your secrets live and all your configurations live unless you provided a key. And so you would store that key somewhere else, offline, or some other system that you consider more secure. And then whenever you want to restart for maintenance or after a failure, you could unlock the Swarm database with that key. Now that key is stored on the hard drive by default because they try to make it easy so that you don't have to worry about your server not working when it reboots, right? Because that's would be the problem if you didn't have the key. So it stores the key in a place that only root can get it. So right now on a default Swarm, you would have to be root to be able to get to that key. But if someone was able to become root on your server, then they could potentially decrypt the Swarm database. This way, if you remove the key off the server, that wouldn't be possible. There's so many other things that Swarm does with security out of the box, but I don't want to go into all those. That's actually a lot of stuff that's in my Docker Mastery and Swarm Mastery courses, where it does encrypted authentication over the wire. The worker nodes are not allowed to see anything except the things they're given permission to see. That includes networks and security keys, secrets. All those things are limited so that if a worker node hasn't been given any tasks, like any containers to run, then it doesn't have any access to that stuff. So it can't even go and snoop on other networks that the other nodes are talking on. So it's a pretty neat system that I think is pretty great out of the box in terms of security. But if you're going to go to the next level, especially a financial institution, you should be looking at something like Docker Enterprise for that high-end security features on top of that. So hopefully that helps. Let's see, what's next? Darren says, how would you recommend learning Groovy? The job I mentioned, if I get it, uses Jenkins, so I need to learn Groovy. I don't know Groovy, so I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that one. Biker says, even though Enterprise comes with layer 7, are there advantages to using traffic instead, like free SSL? So that's an interesting thing. Yes, obviously traffic outside Docker Enterprise Edition does not come with Let's Encrypt, which is a automatic SSL certificate engine, essentially API. That is not built out of the box with Docker Enterprise. So I have not seen anyone use traffic in Docker Enterprise instead of the built-in interlock. I don't see why you can't do it. So if you find an article, you find information about anyone talking about that, let me know, Biker. I would be interested, because I like traffic, but I also understand that, that means now that a portion of your Docker Enterprise you have to manage separately. You have to know what you're doing. You sort of have to you can disable the HTTP, proxy, I'm sure you're aware, inside of Docker Enterprise. So you would essentially be turning that feature off. But traffic's pretty great. So it's not perfect for everyone. So definitely, learn it before you deploy it. I know that there are some people that are, it doesn't do caching, although I'm not sure that the one interlock does caching either. But Nginx can do caching, for example, and that's not a function yet inside of traffic. Traffic is strictly a reverse proxy. If you needed more than just HTTP, then you might look at HA proxy as a front-end proxy, because it can do more than just the HTTP protocols, whereas traffic is very focused on just web traffic protocols. So it's a great question. I've not seen anyone do it, but then again, I don't know everyone running Docker Enterprise, so there's probably somebody doing it. Let's see. The Direxa says, if I understand correctly, Swarm and Kubernetes clusters connections between containers are encrypted. Before, the standard was to have end-to-end encryption between a load balancer and the client, and then from the load balancer to any backend services. Since our connections are from the load balancer to the backend services are inherently encrypted by Swarm or Kubernetes at the orchestration level, is the extra overhead of encrypting HTTP requests worth it on the backend a second time at the container level on top of the orchestrator level encryption? All right. So first off, I want to say that Swarm and Kubernetes by default do not encrypt the connections of your applications, right? Out of the box, Swarm overlay networks encrypt the management traffic, but that's the Raft database talking back and forth, and that's all of the management worker relationships about issuing tasks, right? But when your app talks to your database, it's not encrypted by default in Swarm or Kubernetes. In Swarm, if you want to encrypt that, you can enable IPsec, which is a standard kernel-based encryption mechanism. You can enable that on the particular overlay network that you want it to be on. So it's a per network setting. And you have to do that when you create the network. And then any traffic on that overlay network would be encrypted with IPsec. There is a performance penalty like all encryption. I'm thinking it's somewhere about 3 to 4% or something. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head. But that is Swarm. Now, in the Kubernetes side, Kubernetes allows you to choose your network provider, and different network providers essentially provide different options. So you would have to pick one that has that has encryption built in, and then deploy your apps that way. And I'm unfortunately not well versed enough with all those different, Calico and the other options out there. Weave, they all have their own feature sets and functionalities. So you would have to look at each one of those to see how and if it can encrypt the traffic between your applications. So I would say if I was on Swarm and I was concerned about network traffic encryption, in other words, I don't trust the network I'm running on, then I would default to using the IPsec encryption in Swarm, right? Rather than doing a bunch of HTTPS encryption on top of that in my apps, because now that means that inside my Swarm, I would have to create a bunch of certificates for each app, right? And I would prefer not to have to do that unless I'm forced to. In some cases, some systems force you to do that, and they even do mutually authenticated TLS between apps. I feel like that sometimes is really not necessary. In most cases, I don't feel like it's necessary in Swarm because Swarm already protects the networks, right? So the only way to get on a network is to be assigned to a network through the Docker Swarm management API. So it's kind of like separate VLANs, right? So I don't feel like there's a bunch of open connections that could just allow any of my apps to have, unencrypted, authentic, connections to them. So when you're talking about connections coming into your cluster, that's a whole different ballgame, and that's more up to your applications. Orchestration isn't going to provide inbound encryption. So for your clients over the internet coming and talking to you or whatever, or however your clients connect to your Swarm or your Kubernetes clusters, that's really up to you providing certificates, which is why we need things like traffic and interlock to do that sort of stuff. So hopefully that helps the confusion a little bit, because I don't want you to think that those are all encrypted by default. It's really just the management. And with Kubernetes, because it's definitely a more complex system, you also can't assume out of the box that all of your management traffic is encrypted as well. So that depends on how you install it, which install tool you use, and which provider of Kubernetes you're using, essentially, which distribution. So you want to check with that distribution, whether that's Docker Enterprise or that's Rancher or that's Fargate on AWS or DigitalOcean. Like, all those are different distributions of Kubernetes, and you want to check with those on how they do management encryption and if they offer client application encryption for your clients. So yeah, check that out. Great question though, and glad that we talked about it. Faulkner asked, I just learned Swarm. Should I migrate to Kubernetes? Which advantages one compared to another? So that's a common question that I get not every week, but almost every week on Swarm versus Kubernetes. There are lots of resources on my page, brettfisher.com/Docker. There is an Ask Me Anything that is on that page that will take you to, take you to this GitHub repo. And there are some questions in there. There's a top one right at the very top on Swarm versus Kubernetes, as well as other topics. So check that out, and you can read about Swarm versus Kubernetes. I'm going to refresh again. It seems like Google always wants me to log in when I'm in the middle of a live stream. That's no fun. All right, so that's that's something you can check out there. But essentially, the gist, the 30-second pitch, Swarm is it's a very tight focused set of features that are built into Docker. So it's super easy to deploy. It's very easy to make it highly available and secure out of the box with just 3 nodes. And it uses very little resources. So I always offer it up as the thing you should try first. If you think that your applications can work in Swarm and maybe they don't need all the super advanced features and all the different options you have with Kubernetes, Kubernetes is more like a Swiss Army knife. It does even more than just container orchestration. It can actually be a backend for lots of other things. You can do cron jobs and all sorts of other interesting things with that, essentially becoming a management scheduler on the back end to control lots of stuff, right? Where Swarm is more focused on, you have a bunch of containers, you need to run them for a long time, and you need to get them on secure networks. So, or unencrypted or encrypted networks that are built in. So a lot of that's all built in out of the box. And there's only a few plugins you usually need to get that going. With Kubernetes, you get more out of the box, but it's also more work to install and maintain. So nowadays, typically what we recommend is, if you need to go Kubernetes, then pick a distribution to start with. Don't roll your own Kubernetes from pure open source, because that is hard to get right, and it's also not necessarily obvious how to secure it, encrypt it, make sure that the authentication, known as RBAC, is properly set up so that you don't open yourself to expose yourself to potential internet hacking, and also how to make it highly available so that anything can fail and it still survives, right? To get that right in Kubernetes is a lot more work than it is in Swarm. So nowadays, that's why you see places like AWS and Azure and DigitalOcean all offering up hosted Kubernetes, because they do it in a highly available way, hopefully, and they hopefully build out a more stable infrastructure that you don't have to worry about updating and managing on your own. With Docker and Swarm, it's just an update is just upgrading Docker, and then you're done. With Kubernetes, there's a lot more to it, and I think for that, it's the best thing, especially if you're new to Kubernetes. Obviously, it's great to learn, right? Download the open source, learn the Kubernetes APIs and how that all functions at a low level. But when it comes to doing it in production, I would go with the distribution, either Docker Enterprise or Rancher or OpenShift or one of the cloud-hosted options. Something out there that's going to manage the infrastructure for you and solve a lot of the problems that you would have to manually handle yourself. So that's the difference is to me is more about infrastructure and the management of it than it is in the functionality. If you just have some web services and databases and stuff that you need to run, just try it on Swarm. If you just want to run your own little Swarm, but if you want to use all AWS services, for example, and you only want to use what AWS provides, well, AWS doesn't provide a managed Swarm service, and so you would maybe use ECS or Fargate or something like that, right? EKS. You would pick one of their services to deploy, and you would maybe use CloudFormation to deploy it and all that kind of thing. So anyway, there's a lot of options. I think that the best way to learn, in my opinion, is to start with Swarm, learn Docker, then learn Swarm, then learn Kubernetes. Because there's a lot of things that are similar between Swarm and Kubernetes, and you'll learn Swarm fast, and Kubernetes will take you longer to learn. So why not just try the easy thing first, and then go to the harder thing later. So that's my tip. Other people, I'm sure, have different opinions, but check that out. All right, I'm going to answer one or two more questions because we're running a little long today. But if I don't answer your questions, by the way, in the video, then please stay on just leave the window open if you have to walk away, and I will answer the questions the best I can in text chat in the live stream chat. So once the video is over, I still hang around in chat so we can have conversations in the YouTube chat. Of course, you can always reach me on Twitter and everywhere else. So if you have more questions. All right. Biker's back. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great answer. Suspenders and belt. Yeah. That's a great way to talk about it. And Dexter asked, if someone gets inside the orchestrator, wouldn't the entire Swarm or Kubernetes cluster be compromised regardless? So yes, if someone got root on one of your managers, then, or one of your, in Kubernetes, one of your SED nodes or something, or if they got one of the core API keys, yes, they're essentially going to be able to do whatever they want. They can start and stop containers. They can deploy, new networks and new containers and mess with your data. So yeah, they pretty much at that point own the system, which is why you don't want those systems publicly exposed in an easy way, right? You don't want those on default ports. You don't want unauthenticated ports to be out there. And if you've looked in the news, you've seen in the history that that's happened. Like even Tesla, the car company, they had a Kubernetes cluster with, I think, either the default password or no password on one of their clusters. And someone on the internet found it and started mining Bitcoin on it. So you definitely want to lock that stuff down. All right. Audi, I see your question on generalizing K8's YAML files and CI/CD. Developer commit code, execute Docker build with commit ID. Do you suggest to use Linux sed or env-subst? I wouldn't do sed. I would use environment substitute. And so the question here is about a tool called env-subst. And what that is a really neat Linux utility that doesn't come with every distribution, but I think it comes with the git text dependency in apt-get or something. And it's a command line tool that takes a file that you have of environment settings and then uses the file that you mean for those environment settings to go into. And that let's say it's a MySQL config. And that config file has environment variables set in it. And it'll basically give you a one-liner to replace all of the stuff inside of one of your config files with environment variable settings, either from a different file. And it's a one-liner. Sed, the problem with sed is that it's not, unless you know sed, well, it's very powerful, right? Sed and awk are very powerful Linux tools. But unless you know that tool, looking at the line won't make any sense to you. You won't really know what it's doing necessarily or how it's doing it. and you can't easily do that, at least off the top of my head, with sed. You'd have to have like a line of sed for each change you'd want to make. I could be wrong. Maybe there is a way to do it. There's always a way to do it in Linux in a one-liner. So if you're curious about that stuff, just search that tool in the Docker documentation. And Docker actually has an example, right, of using the env-subst tool on how to replace environment variables inside of config files with a one-liner. And I know there's somewhere, yeah. So like they show an example here on this Nginx page. Yeah, right here, where they use a one-line bash liner, one-line command here that takes a template and then a set of environment variables and does a sort of search and replace algorithm on that. And it's pretty neat. It works great. So I would use that because I feel like that for most people that are uninformed, that tool makes sense and they can look at the files and make sense of what needs to go where in each file, right? But with sed, I feel like you have to have a lot of training. You need to research the tool and understand how the tool works. So yeah. All right, one last question. Yeah, Dextra says, Tesla automated electronic car production company by day and automated Bitcoin mining company by night. Yeah, at least for a few days. I don't know how long that lasted, but yeah, definitely for a little bit. And if you didn't know, basically any server you put on the internet, if you expose anything that someone can find, eventually it will become a Bitcoin miner. That's the new, the new thing. It's not, we don't care about defacing websites as much anymore as we do just making money off of mining Bitcoin on your site. So I say I'm not doing it. I have never mined Bitcoin, not because I just don't have time. Who's got the time for that? All right, one last question. To build your own pipeline, is it possible to use Docker images or should I learn Jenkins first? Great question. So what's interesting is a Docker file is kind of like a build pipeline, right? Each line, it's a very simple version. It doesn't have a bunch of trees and stuff, like different branches of where it can go. But a traditional Docker file goes top down, and you can put your tests in there. Like for node.js, you could put npm test as a line. And if your tests fail, then the Docker file fails to build the image. And then if you were running that somewhere, you could essentially get back a failed state, an exit 1, and it would cause your whatever you're looking, if you're monitoring for that state, then you would know that your image failed building, and you may not need a full-on Jenkins solution in very simple cases. In fact, if you use Docker Hub to build your images, that's how you can use Docker Hub as sort of a cheap, way to do CI. Is you just take your Docker file, put all your tests in your Docker file, and then Docker Hub will do the testing as part of building your image, right? So now that we have nowadays, if you're interested in that at all and considering maybe for simple solutions not having full-on build tools like Jenkins or Travis CI or GitLab or anything like that, CodeShip, all those tools, then what you want to look into is multi-stage builds and build kit. Because, and we talked about it on this channel, if you actually search inside this channel or just search on YouTube, Brett Fisher build kit, you'll find some examples where, that's one word by the way, build kit. Those two features, multi-stage and build kit, are relatively new features to Docker building, and those together can really get you a parallel multi-branch type of building solution that's essentially just like a CI solution in terms of what it can execute. Now, does it have a nice graphical web interface that shows you the status of all the jobs and lets you look back in time at all the history? No, it doesn't have any of that. But yes, absolutely. I do consider Docker builds a simple CI solution because what is it doing, right? It's executing a line, and then if there's an error and an exit status that's not 0, like an exit 1 or an exit 127, then it fails the build, which is essentially what your CI solution is supposed to do for you, right? Run a bunch of commands, and if any of them fail, tell somebody. So yeah, I would definitely recommending those, looking at those two features, build kit and multi-stage. All right, well, that's it for today. Biker, I see your last comment. I'll comment on that if it needs a comment after this video, but Thanks for staying. Thanks for watching. If you want to check out any of my courses or any of my free tools or resources, including my DockerCon talks, all my open source repos for samples, check all that stuff out at brettfisher.com/docker. And I will be back here next week at the same time on this channel. And so click the subscribe and click the bell so you get notified when I go live next week. And I'll see you on the internet at some time in the future. Bye.